The town appears on maps, but no one alive can say why. There's no trace of it now, no buildings, no people, no remnants of its existence. But still, it lingers on maps as though it were an echo from a time long gone. The question looms, why does it still exist in ink and paper in the digital grids of modern maps, when it has been wiped from memory and erased from the land? In a quiet corner of the world, hidden deep within the dense forests and rolling hills, lies a mystery that no one seems to understand. This is not a story about some forgotten corner of civilization that has simply faded with time. It's not the kind of town that was overrun by war or swallowed by a natural disaster. No, this is different. This is a place that was deliberately erased, not just from physical existence but from the collective consciousness of the world. And yet, somehow, it refuses to vanish. The name of the town still appears on maps. Maps that haven't been updated in decades, sometimes centuries. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when researchers, historians, and amateur explorers began to notice something peculiar. No one could find it. The town, which was once a lively community, a place with a bustling market square, cobblestone streets, and the warmth of a tight-knit neighborhood, had vanished from the face of the earth, as though it had never existed in the first place. Those few who knew of its existence could only speak of it in whispers, as if the very act of remembering it might summon some long-buried terror. People began asking questions. It's not unusual for a town to disappear over time, especially if it's in a remote location, abandoned due to economic decline, or overwhelmed by natural disasters. But this wasn't like that. The records, government records, postal records, even birth and death certificates, they all led to a dead end. No one could find a definitive reason for why this town had vanished, and in the wake of its disappearance, the few scattered documents or photographs that had once captured its spirit faded into obscurity. The researchers who stumbled upon the town's name, still present on the maps, were intrigued. Their curiosity turned into obsession as they began to dig deeper into the history of the place, trying to uncover the truth. But the more they searched, the stranger things became. The town was listed in records, some from as early as the late 1700s, others much later, but no one had any real recollection of it. People who had supposedly lived there in the past were either completely untraceable or reported to have vanished as well, never to be heard from again. All that remained were the maps, and even they were beginning to fade, their ink blurring into the lines of modern cartography. What they found, however, was far more disturbing than they ever expected. Evidence of the town's existence was scattered across the years, tucked away in forgotten libraries, tucked between the pages of old government documents, and scribbled in personal diaries that had long been abandoned. Each new discovery seemed to add a piece to the puzzle, but also created more questions. Why had the town been erased so completely? What had happened to the people who once lived there? And most chilling of all, why was the town still on the map? The mystery deepened with each new clue they uncovered. Old photographs from the late 1800s painted a picture of a town that appeared to be flourishing. The people looked proud, the streets seemed full of life, and there was even a picture of a large building, a hall perhaps, that stood at the center of the town. But as the researchers began to dig further into the archives, the photographs grew sparse, and the records grew muddled. The earliest mentions of the town seemed to go quiet at some point in the mid-1900s, as though it had suddenly fallen off the map, not in a literal sense but in a historical one. It wasn't just abandoned, it had been deliberately forgotten. Historians dug into old town charters, reaching out to local officials and even investigating census data. What they uncovered was nothing short of staggering. The town had vanished from not only physical existence, but its name had been erased from official records. Government buildings, which should have held vital information, were inexplicably sealed off, and anyone who tried to investigate the disappearance was met with strange roadblocks. Official statements regarding the town's fall were either non-existent or so heavily redacted that they raised more questions than they answered. One of the most puzzling aspects of the mystery was the secrecy surrounding the town's demise. Why had no one spoken about it? Why did even the oldest residents of nearby towns seem to have no recollection of it? If the town had been abandoned, why had no one come forward to explain the reason? The eerie silence surrounding the town's end only fueled the investigation, but with each new lead, the situation became increasingly bizarre. As the investigators unearthed more forgotten records, they discovered rumors of a tragic event, a disaster of some sort that had befallen the town, a catastrophe that had taken everything from the residents, including their memories. But what was this disaster? Was it a flood, a fire, or some other catastrophic event? The historical documents didn't provide a clear answer, and no one seemed willing to talk about it. People who had grown up in nearby towns had never heard of the place. Even those who had lived in the general area only a few miles away seemed to be unaware of any large settlement ever having existed in that spot. The investigators tried reaching out to old families in neighboring towns. Some of them spoke hesitantly of an old settlement, a place that had been there years ago but had long since faded away. Yet there was always something strange in their voices. A nervousness, a hesitation as if they were afraid to go any further. And when they were asked why, their responses were often vague, like they didn't want to recall something painful. But what? And why? Something wasn't adding up. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came when a team of researchers uncovered a personal diary from someone who had lived in the town before it disappeared. The entries painted a dark picture of a once thriving community slowly being overtaken by strange events. The last few pages were filled with cryptic warnings, written in a hurried hand. Don't trust the town's name. It's a trap. We are being watched. What did this mean? Who was watching them? And why had no one come forward with any explanation? As more details emerged, a pattern began to emerge in the strange series of events. A sense of unease gripped the town in the months leading up to its disappearance. People had begun to act strangely, withdrawing from each other, speaking in hushed tones and becoming fearful. There were whispers of a sinister force at play, something beyond the natural realm, something that couldn't be explained. Some even said that the town had become cursed, that a terrible secret had been buried there for generations, a secret that had finally come to light and led to the town's undoing. But the worst part of the mystery is this: no one really knows. All that remains are fragmented stories, half-buried facts, and the eerie presence of a town that exists only on paper. Its name may be forgotten by most, but the map still holds its place. A forgotten town that still, somehow, refuses to be erased. The town once stood proudly, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering cliffs and rolling hills. A place where families had raised their children, where businesses flourished, and where life was woven with the mundane beauty of small-town existence. It wasn't much different from any other rural settlement in the region, until it was. From the outside it might have seemed like just another dot on the map, but for those who lived there it was home. A home that, for reasons no one truly understood, was destined to disappear. The town's founding dates back to the late 1700s, a period when the area was being settled by pioneers seeking land and opportunity in the rugged wilderness. The town, known by a name that only a few now recall, grew out of necessity, a place for those making a life in an unforgiving world. It was no accidental settlement. It had been designed with care. Streets were laid out with intention, each one named after the prominent figures of the time, men who had labored to build it from the ground up. There was a central square where farmers gathered to sell their goods and traders passed through, and a small church at the heart of the town that had served as a gathering place for both worship and community events. In those early days the town was a bustling little hub, a hidden gem in the wilderness. It attracted families looking for stability, young couples eager to start fresh, and veterans returning from distant wars. There were tales of the streets being filled with laughter and the hum of daily life. Families sat on porches in the evenings, children played in the streets, and the sound of church bells rang every Sunday, marking the rhythms of life. The town wasn't just a place, it was a community, bound together by shared struggles and triumphs, by the desire for something better in a world that seemed to be forever on the edge of change. In the early years the economy was simple but thriving. There were local farms that provided food to the surrounding areas, a handful of merchants who had set up shop, and even a small school where the children of the town were educated. Life was humble but steady. It wasn't a town of grand wealth, but the people there didn't need much. They were content in their quiet, rustic lives, far from the noise and chaos of the growing cities. But even in such a seemingly peaceful setting, cracks were beginning to show. History has a way of revealing itself in subtle ways, and the town's story was no different. There were whispers, stories passed from one generation to the next, about strange happenings in the town's early years. Small things at first, unexplained noises in the night, shadows moving where there should have been none. Then came the odd disappearances, one or two residents who seemed to vanish without a trace. At first no one paid much attention. People left towns all the time in those days, seeking better opportunities elsewhere. But as the years went on, the disappearances became harder to ignore. Rumors spread that the missing had not simply chosen to leave, they had been taken. The first major event to shake the town occurred in the late 1800s, when a fire ravaged the northern end of the settlement. It began on a stormy night, lightning striking one of the old timber buildings that lined the edge of town. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the dry wood and the wind that howled through the streets. Despite the best efforts of the townsfolk, the flames consumed much of the town before they could be contained. There were casualties and many homes were lost. But the most significant loss was something more intangible: the town's sense of security. It had been a close-knit place where everyone knew everyone else. But after the fire, that unity began to fracture. It was as though the fire had ignited something in the town's soul, something that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface. In the aftermath of the fire, the town began to change. People grew suspicious, wary of their neighbors, and new families, unfamiliar faces, started to trickle in. Though the town rebuilt, it was never quite the same. The fire had left a scar that no amount of rebuilding could erase. But worse than the fire itself was the strange series of events that followed it. The residents began to notice that things weren't as they seemed. People started leaving again, this time without explanation. Others fell ill with strange, unidentifiable ailments. Those who stayed became more and more isolated, withdrawing into themselves and their homes. It was as though some unseen force had begun to take hold of the town, slowly, insidiously, until it was too late to stop it. As the years passed, these strange occurrences began to compound. People began to talk in hushed voices about a dark force that had somehow taken root in the town, but no one dared to speak openly about it. It wasn't just the fires or the illnesses, it was the sense of unease, the feeling that something was very wrong. It was in the way the town's residents began to behave, in their furtive glances, in the way they seemed to avoid talking about the past. It was as if they had all agreed, without ever saying it aloud, that the town's history was something better left forgotten. And then came the silence. The town, once vibrant and full of life, seemed to sink into an eerie quiet. People stopped coming to church. The market square grew empty, the buildings began to fall into disrepair. Families packed up and left without explanation, and those who remained were fewer and fewer. In the span of a few decades, the once thriving town began to feel like a ghost town, as if it had already died, even though it was still there. The first official reports of the town's decline came in the 1920s, when the local government began to notice the strange disappearance of residents. Officials went to investigate, but when they arrived, they found a ghostly, desolate place. The streets were silent, the houses abandoned. There were no answers. Some of the town's old residents had vanished completely, leaving no trace. Others had simply disappeared, leaving behind only empty homes and half-finished tasks. Those who remained couldn't or wouldn't provide any real explanation for what had happened. By the time the town reached the 1940s, it had all but disappeared. Records show that the last few remaining families were quietly relocated, with no fanfare and little notice. The town, once full of life, was wiped from the map, or so it seemed. The official records stopped mentioning it, and the town's name slowly faded into the annals of forgotten history. But even as the world moved on, there were still whispers of the town's strange legacy, its sudden and inexplicable disappearance. And yet, the town still remained, at least on paper. Maps from decades ago still marked its location, as though its absence had never happened. In official maps, both old and new, the town's name appeared, a faded shadow on the grid. No one really knew why. In the places where the town had once stood, there was nothing but open land. The buildings were gone, the streets overgrown, and nature had slowly reclaimed what had once been a thriving settlement. But the maps would not forget. And neither would those few who still remembered. There was a mystery at the heart of it all, a question that no one had ever been able to answer. Why did the town disappear, and why does it still exist in the records, in the maps, as though it had never truly gone away? It was in the early 20th century that the first whispers of the town's mysterious disappearance began to surface. The town had never been large, but it had been a solid part of the region, its name appearing on maps, in records, and in the memories of those who had passed through. When the local authorities first noticed the absence of any further reports or updates from the town, they simply chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of rural life. People leave, families move, and towns lose their vitality over time. It wasn't until the town was officially marked as abandoned that questions started to arise. What had really happened to the place? Why were no efforts made to track its population? Why had no one stepped forward to explain what had happened? As the years passed, the town's story became less and less of a priority, but those few who still remembered the once thriving settlement couldn't shake the eerie sense that something more had taken place. Something darker. In the early 1920s, a local historian named Edward Caldwell came across something that would ignite the investigation into the town's disappearance. Caldwell was combing through old local records, trying to uncover the history of a nearby region, when he stumbled upon a journal entry from a government inspector who had been sent to investigate the town in the late 1800s. The journal entry spoke of a curious atmosphere in the town, an unsettling quiet that hung over the settlement like a thick fog. The inspector described how, when he arrived, he had expected to find a lively, active place, but instead he was met with an eerie emptiness. The streets were unusually quiet for the time of day, the market was closed, and most of the houses were locked with no sign of life. The inspector wrote of a feeling of being watched, of strange noises in the distance, and of an unsettling sense that the town wasn't as it appeared. There was a vague mention of something unseen, but no further details were given. The journal was filled with references to odd occurrences that had taken place during his stay. And at the very end, the last few lines were hastily scribbled in a frenzied hand. "Something is here. Something that doesn't belong. I'm leaving tomorrow. You'll hear from me no more." The entry struck Caldwell as deeply strange, especially considering that the inspector's report was the last one ever written about the town. There had been no follow-up, no additional visits, and no further mention of the settlement. It was as though the official records had simply shut the door on the town and locked it away forever. Caldwell's curiosity was piqued, and he dug deeper into the history of the town. What he found only made things more disturbing. As he continued to investigate, Caldwell discovered that the few people who had lived near the town had begun to talk about strange happenings in the years leading up to its disappearance. They spoke of lights in the sky that couldn't be explained, of odd sounds emanating from the woods at night, and of the townspeople's increasing fear of something that couldn't be named. The reports from those who had known the town seemed inconsistent, as though they were reluctant to speak about what had really happened. Most troubling of all was a letter Caldwell found in the private collection of a local doctor, who had been one of the last people to have lived in the town before its disappearance. The letter was from a woman named Mary Hawthorne, whose family had been among the first to settle in the town. In the letter, dated just a month before the town was officially abandoned, she spoke of an unnatural presence in the town. "It has been growing for months now," she wrote, "and I don't know how much longer we can stay here. I don't want to believe it, but there are some things that are beyond our control." The letter ended with a chilling line, "I fear we are being watched by something that is not human." What was even more unsettling about the letter was its final sentence. "We're leaving. I don't know where, but we must go. We must disappear too." Caldwell tried to track down any remaining records of the Hawthorne family, but they had seemingly vanished without a trace. There was no mention of them in the local archives, no evidence that they had ever existed beyond the letter. It was as if they, along with the entire town, had been erased. He began to suspect that the disappearance was not simply a case of rural abandonment, but something far more deliberate and strange. In his search, Caldwell uncovered more reports from other townspeople who had left the area before the final exodus. They all spoke of a growing sense of dread that had descended upon the town. There were whispers of something sinister in the woods surrounding the settlement, something that wasn't quite natural. And then, as if on cue, the townspeople began to leave one by one without explanation. They didn't speak of where they were going or why they had to leave. The town emptied out at a terrifying pace. No one ever returned. But even though the people were gone, something about the place seemed to linger. The houses remained standing, the streets still faintly marked on maps, but the town itself seemed to resist being fully forgotten. It was as if the land itself refused to erase the memories, or worse, as though the town was never meant to disappear completely. As Caldwell pieced together the fragmented stories, the sense of unease deepened. Something had happened in that town, something dark and powerful. The townspeople knew it, but they couldn't, or wouldn't, talk about it. And in the years that followed, any attempts to revisit the town were met with strange, unexplainable phenomena. Those who had ventured near its remains spoke of odd disturbances, strange lights flickering in the distance, faint whispers on the wind, and a deep, uncomfortable silence that enveloped the area. It wasn't long before Caldwell realized that the town's disappearance was far from ordinary. It wasn't just a town that had been abandoned. It was a place that had been actively erased. Someone, or something, had made sure that no trace of it would remain. Government records were tampered with, photographs went missing, and documents were either destroyed or hidden away. The more Caldwell uncovered, the more he was certain that the town had been erased for a reason, but what that reason was he still couldn't fathom. Determined to uncover the truth, Caldwell sought the help of other researchers and local historians, hoping to pool their resources and knowledge. But as they delved further into the mystery, they too began to experience strange occurrences. One researcher who had been investigating the site was found unconscious near the town's remains, his journal torn and scattered around him. The last entry in his notebook was chilling. The town was erased, but it is not gone. It is still watching. It is still waiting. Caldwell's investigation ultimately led him to the unsettling conclusion that whatever had caused the town's disappearance was far beyond ordinary human understanding. The town had become a ghost, not just in the physical sense but in the very fabric of history itself. It was as if the town had never existed at all, and yet, it still lingered, forever trapped between memory and oblivion. The question remained, why had this town been erased from existence? What dark force had been at work, and why did the town still linger on maps, stubbornly refusing to disappear entirely? Each new lead only deepened the mystery, leaving more questions than answers. It was only after Edward Caldwell's exhaustive research that the first hints of the survivors began to emerge. For years, it was believed that everyone who had once lived in the town had vanished, erased either by the unnatural forces that had plagued the settlement or simply disappeared into the vast unknown. But Caldwell's persistence, coupled with a growing sense of urgency, led him to the discovery of a small handful of individuals who had left the town just before its disappearance. Some of them were still alive, others had long passed, but the few who remained might hold the key to understanding what happened in the town all those years ago. Caldwell's first breakthrough came when he contacted an elderly woman named Alice Harper. Alice, who was in her early 90s by then, had been a child living in the town at the time of its strange collapse. She had left with her family just days before the last wave of departures, though she had no real memory of why they left so abruptly. The last thing she recalled, she said, was her mother hurriedly packing their things while her father kept looking over his shoulder as though someone, or something, was watching them. "I remember the way the house felt that night," Alice said in an interview conducted in her small, quiet home on the outskirts of a neighboring town. "It was like the walls were closing in on us. My mother told me to keep quiet, to not make a sound. I could hear my father talking in the other room, but his voice didn't sound right. It was like he was speaking to someone, but no one was there." Alice's account echoed what Caldwell had uncovered through his research, a pervasive, growing sense of unease that had plagued the town. For weeks, the townspeople had been leaving in secret, avoiding conversations about why they were going. Some families, like Alice's, had just packed up and left, disappearing into the night without ever returning. What was most unsettling, however, was the suddenness of it all. The exodus had been so complete, so rapid, that it left the entire town vacant in the span of a few short weeks. People didn't simply leave for better prospects or to escape hardship. They fled, and they did so as though they were running from something. Alice recalled hearing stories from other children about strange figures in the woods, about lights in the sky that couldn't be explained, and about a constant, pervasive feeling of being watched. These were not stories of the supernatural, she explained. They were tales told in hushed voices by the older children, passed down from one generation to the next, until they became folklore of a town steeped in mystery. And yet, Alice admitted, there was something undeniably unsettling about the memories of those days. There was something about it, something wrong, she confessed. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it in my bones. Whatever happened there, it wasn't natural. Her words were strikingly similar to those found in the journals of other former residents who had long since disappeared from public record. Caldwell was beginning to understand that Alice's account, though seemingly innocuous, was a critical piece in the larger puzzle. But there was more to her story, something far darker that Alice had been too afraid to share at first. Several weeks after their initial conversation, Alice agreed to meet with Caldwell again, but this time her demeanor had changed. She was visibly more anxious, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted her final memory of the town. "It was the night we left," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was sleeping, but I woke up to my mother crying. I didn't know why at first, but when I went to her room, I saw that the window was open. The wind was howling outside, and there was something watching us through the glass. I can't explain it, but I swear it wasn't human. I saw the figure standing there, just staring at me with eyes that weren't eyes at all. And then, just like that, it was gone." Caldwell's heart raced as Alice's story grew more bizarre. "What do you mean by eyes that weren't eyes?" he asked, trying to understand the deeper meaning behind her words. Alice hesitated before continuing. It was like the face wasn't a face, just darkness. And the eyes, they were black, empty, like they were swallowing up everything around them. My mother said we had to leave immediately. We packed everything and left in the middle of the night, even though we didn't know where we were going. And the thing is, after we left, we never went back. I don't think anyone ever did. We just disappeared." The darkness Alice described was reminiscent of the reports Caldwell had found scattered throughout his research. The vague accounts of people who had seen strange figures at the edges of the woods, the unsettling whispers in the night, the increasing tension that had suffocated the town in the months leading up to its vanishing, everything now seemed connected. But what was the source of this malevolent force? And why had it chosen the town? As Caldwell dug deeper, more fragments of truth came to light. One of the most chilling discoveries was a series of cryptic messages left by a local priest, Father William Mason, who had been one of the last people to remain in the town. Father Mason's letters, discovered in a hidden box in the old church's basement, spoke of an increasing darkness in the town, an invisible presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The final letter, dated just days before the priest was last seen, contained the following passage: "The town has become a beacon, a place where something has come to rest, something ancient and hungry. I have seen it. I have felt it. The people are afraid, but they do not speak of it. There is no escape from it. I fear that by the time you read this, I will have already become a part of it." Father Mason's letter was the final piece that connected the pieces of the puzzle. Whatever was haunting the town had not been a mere force of nature or coincidence. It was something far older, something that had been lying dormant for generations, waiting for the right time to surface. Caldwell now believed that the town had not simply been abandoned. It had been abandoned because of a malevolent force that had driven the people out. But as the survivors' stories began to paint a clearer picture, Caldwell realized that there was still so much left unsaid. Alice's memory was only one of many, and the few surviving records painted a picture of a town that had been slowly taken over by this force, until no one could remain. It was as though the town itself had become a vessel for something darker, something that had consumed everything, every person, every memory, every piece of evidence. The survivors, like Alice, had lived to tell their story, but they had paid a heavy price. Alice was never the same after leaving the town. The fear she had carried with her remained, haunting her in the quiet moments, lingering in her mind like a shadow. Her memories of that time were fragmented, disjointed, but there was no mistaking the terror she had experienced. She had seen something in that town, something that had no business being there. And it was something that had left a permanent mark on her, something she would never be able to fully escape. In the years that followed, the mystery of the town remained unsolved, but Caldwell's investigation had shed light on the horrors that had unfolded there. The few survivors who had remained tight-lipped for decades now found themselves burdened with the truth. The town had not simply disappeared, it had been consumed by something far beyond human understanding. And the question that remained, why? Why had the town been chosen? What had driven it to the brink of extinction, and why had no one ever spoken of it before? As Caldwell sat in his study, piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle, he could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing on him. The answers were still out there, hidden in the shadows of history. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that the town's story was not just a tale of a forgotten place. It was a warning. Whatever had happened in that town was not over. It lingered in the dark corners of the world, waiting for the next time it would reveal itself. And that was a truth no one could ignore. As the investigation into the town's disappearance deepened, Caldwell found himself at the edge of something far greater than he had anticipated. The survivors, now in their twilight years, had begun to speak out. Their memories, once buried in silence, were emerging from the shadows. They were hesitant, their voices often quivering, as if speaking of the town was a betrayal of some unspoken agreement. But Caldwell knew that this was no longer about the town itself. This was about uncovering the truth that had been hidden for so long. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Caldwell spoke to Thomas Blackwell, a former resident who had been one of the last to leave the town. Thomas was a tall, imposing figure in his mid-80s, his body worn by time but his mind still sharp. He had spent most of his adult life as a farmer, but his memories of the town and what happened there were anything but ordinary. He had left in a rush, taking only the bare essentials with him, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear, as though he had seen something no one should ever see. For decades, Thomas remained silent, only telling his family vague stories of a bad feeling and a darkness that had settled over the town. But now Caldwell was face to face with him, hoping to learn the truth. Thomas sat across from Caldwell in a small, dimly lit living room, the weight of his silence palpable in the air. It was clear that he had been waiting for this moment, though he had not been ready for it for all these years. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas spoke, his voice low but steady. "I didn't want to talk about it. Never did. But now I reckon it's time." He took a deep breath, the lines on his face creasing as he looked out the window, almost as though he could see the town again just beyond the horizon. We all knew something wasn't right. We could feel it in the air, in our bones. The land itself felt wrong. It wasn't just the weird noises at night or the strange figures some of us saw in the woods. It was everything. People started to change little by little. Not in ways you'd notice right away, but enough for you to feel something was off. Caldwell leaned forward, his notebook ready to catch every word. "What do you mean by change?" he asked, his heart racing with anticipation. Thomas paused for a long moment before continuing. "It started with the way people acted. Folks who'd been friends for years suddenly didn't speak to each other. Families who lived side by side stopped coming to church. People kept to themselves more and more. But it wasn't just that. Some of the children started acting strange. They'd whisper things they shouldn't know, talk about things they couldn't possibly understand. It was like they were hearing voices no one else could hear." He looked Caldwell directly in the eye, his expression grim. "That's when I knew something was happening. Something real, something nobody wanted to talk about. And then came the lights." The mention of lights sent a chill through Caldwell's spine. He had heard rumors before, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it made the story seem all too real. "What kind of lights?" he asked, though he had an inkling of the answer. Thomas's eyes darkened as he recalled the events of that night. At first it was just a flicker out on the horizon. A strange glow, almost like a fire, but it wasn't a fire. Moved. It danced across the sky, twisting and turning in ways no light should. Some said it was the northern lights, but we all knew that wasn't right. It came too close, too erratically. It came down on the town. Caldwell felt a tightening in his chest. The pieces were beginning to align in ways he hadn't expected. The town's disappearance, the strange happenings, the figures in the woods. This was no random series of events. This was something planned, something orchestrated. But by whom? And why? Thomas leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking slightly. The night they came, we thought it was just another storm, just another weird occurrence. But it wasn't. It was like the sky itself was coming down on us. The lights, they circled the town, hovered over it like they were watching. And that's when we heard it, the voices. Voices. Caldwell echoed, now fully engrossed in the tale. Thomas nodded, his expression distant as though he was replaying the night in his mind. At first it was just a murmur, like whispers carried on the wind. But then it grew louder. A hum, a low sound that rattled the walls of our homes. And the worst part? It was in our heads. You could hear it in your mind, in your thoughts, like it was inside you, not outside. Telling you things that didn't make sense. And it wasn't just me. It was everyone. We all heard it. Thomas's eyes grew wider as he spoke, his voice trembling. The voices, they weren't just whispers. They were instructions. They told us what to do, who to trust, who to avoid. It was like a command. And the worst part? We couldn't ignore it. The longer we stayed, the harder it became to think for ourselves. It was as though something was taking control of our minds, pulling at the very fabric of who we were. Caldwell's mind raced. The connection to the strange figure Alice had seen, the dark presence, was undeniable now. But what was this force? What had driven it to take hold of the town so completely? "I know what you're thinking," Thomas said, interrupting his train of thought. "But I swear to you, we didn't leave because we wanted to. We left because we had no choice. After a while, people started disappearing. Not just the old folks or those who'd never fit in. Everyone. People started vanishing one by one until it was just a handful of us left. The lights, the voices, it was all part of it." The darkness in Thomas's voice was palpable, and Caldwell knew that this was the moment the investigation had been leading to, the realization that whatever had caused the town's downfall was not natural, not of this world. It was something far older, far more dangerous. Did anyone try to stop it? To fight back? Caldwell asked, his voice low. Thomas shook his head slowly. "We tried. I tried. But the more you fought, the more it took. It started with little things. A feeling in your chest like a weight. Then it was the dreams, nightmares that felt like memories. And then, people just stopped caring. They stopped asking questions. They just did what they were told. And when the last of us left, we did so without a word, without a goodbye." Thomas stared at Caldwell, his eyes haunted. "I don't know what happened after we left. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that town didn't just go away. It's still there waiting, watching." The silence between them was deafening as Caldwell processed Thomas's words. The terror in his voice was undeniable. There had been something in that town, something dark, something that had preyed upon the people there, slowly consuming them until nothing was left but an empty shell. But why? What was its purpose? What did it want? Caldwell felt the weight of these questions bearing down on him. The deeper he delved into this mystery, the more it felt like he was uncovering a truth that could never be fully understood. The town had been erased, yes, but what remained was far more insidious than anyone could have imagined. And as Caldwell looked into Thomas's eyes, he realized that the story of the town, its disappearance, and the strange forces that had consumed it was far from over. It was only just beginning. The answers, it seemed, were still out there, but the more he uncovered, the more the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the light of truth piece by piece. The more Caldwell learned, the more he understood the gravity of what he was investigating. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture that was emerging was not one he had expected. The town's disappearance was not a mere accident, nor was it the result of a natural disaster or economic decline. It had been orchestrated. It had been a carefully executed, gradual unraveling of everything that the town and its people once knew. But orchestrated by whom? And for what purpose? Despite the terrifying nature of the revelations, Caldwell couldn't stop. Every new discovery led him deeper into a world that seemed to operate by rules beyond the natural, a realm where forces beyond comprehension held sway. He knew now that this wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was a warning, a haunting legacy of something ancient that had clawed its way into the world. The stories he had gathered from survivors, from townspeople like Alice and Thomas, painted a clearer picture of what had transpired. The lights, the strange voices, the mysterious figures in the woods, they were all connected. Caldwell's mind kept circling back to the one question that had yet to be answered. What was it? What had consumed the town and left nothing but a whisper on the wind? One evening, as he was reviewing the vast collection of notes he had gathered, Caldwell came across something that had initially slipped past his attention. It was a faded map, an old document hidden beneath several other research papers. The map was of the area surrounding the town, but there was something different about it. The topography seemed off, almost as though it had been intentionally altered. As he studied it, Caldwell noticed something disturbing. A strange symbol, etched into the edge of the map, marking the precise location of the town. The symbol was not something he had seen before, nor was it a part of any known language. It was something cryptic, an emblem that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It was as if the symbol itself held power, and Caldwell could feel it, like a cold chill creeping down his spine. The symbol was not just a marking, it was a boundary. It was as though it had been placed there to protect something, or to keep something contained. Caldwell felt a wave of dread wash over him. What if this symbol was more than just a map marker? What if it was the key to understanding what had really happened in the town? His heart pounded in his chest as he researched further. The symbol appeared again and again, scattered across ancient texts and cryptic documents he had not yet fully understood. One text in particular, an old grimoire he had uncovered in a forgotten archive, contained a description that made his blood run cold. The grimoire spoke of an ancient force, one that existed in the spaces between worlds. This force, according to the text, had the ability to seep into reality, to twist the fabric of existence itself. The symbol, the grimoire suggested, was a mark of this force, an ancient sigil used to bind it, to control it, and to prevent it from breaking free. Caldwell's hands trembled as he read on. The text described a ritual that had been used to contain the force, to keep it bound within the earth, deep beneath the town. But the ritual had not been perfect. Over time, the force had grown, feeding on the energy of the land and the people who lived there. It had begun to influence the town, manipulating the residents, turning them against each other, feeding on their fear and anxiety. The force had been waiting for the right moment to break free, and the town had unwittingly provided the perfect environment for it to do so. The more Caldwell uncovered, the more he realized that the town had been a focal point for something much older and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The town was not a random location. It had been chosen because of its proximity to this dark force. And as the force grew stronger, it began to consume everything in its path. People had started to notice the changes, the odd behavior, the strange occurrences. But by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The force had already taken hold. Caldwell's mind raced as he pieced together the terrifying truth. The town's disappearance wasn't a result of people simply leaving. It had been wiped from existence, deliberately, systematically. The townspeople had fled, yes, but not because they had a choice. They had been forced out by the force that had taken root in their lives. The lights in the sky, the figures in the woods, the voices in their heads, it was all part of the force's influence, its attempt to claim the town as its own. But why had the town been the target? Why not another place, another town with fewer people, less history? The answer lay in the ancient ritual that had first bound the force. The town, for reasons unknown, had been built over a site that was a direct connection to the force's power. It was a convergence point between the physical and the supernatural, a place where the fabric of reality was thin. This made the town a perfect vessel for the force, a place where it could manifest itself fully and spread its influence. But the ritual, the grimoire explained, had not been able to hold the force forever. Over time, the energy that kept it contained began to weaken. The people of the town, unaware of the dark force that surrounded them, had unwittingly contributed to its growing power. They had built their homes on land that was already cursed, and in doing so, they had unknowingly nurtured the very thing that would destroy them. Caldwell knew that the answers he had uncovered were only part of the story. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to understand. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. As his research into the town continued, Caldwell began to feel the weight of something intangible pressing against him. The closer he got to the truth, the more it seemed like the town's curse was following him. Strange things began to happen around him. Objects in his office moved when no one was there, odd sounds echoed through the walls, and a constant unease settled over him like a shadow. At night, Caldwell would dream of the town, its empty streets, its crumbling buildings, and the eerie glow that hovered over the land. In his dreams, he could hear the voices of the townspeople calling out to him, urging him to come closer to find them. But when he tried to follow the voices, they always led him to the same place, the center of the town where the ritual had first been performed. There, in his dreams, he would see the symbol again, glowing in the darkness, its power radiating outwards like a beacon. Caldwell's obsession grew. He knew he couldn't stop now. He had to understand what had happened, why the town had vanished, and why it still lingered on the edges of reality. But the deeper he delved, the more he realized that the town's curse was not confined to its original location. It had spread. The force, whatever it was, had infected everything it touched. It had begun to reach into the world beyond the town, following the survivors, following him. The town was gone, but the darkness remained. And as Caldwell's investigation took him further into the depths of the unknown, he couldn't shake the feeling that the town was still watching him. It wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just a place that had disappeared. It was a living, breathing force, one that had taken root in the land, in the very fabric of time itself. And as long as the town remained on the map, it would never truly disappear. Caldwell knew he was standing on the precipice of something far greater than he could comprehend. The town, its disappearance, the dark force, it was all part of a much larger, much older mystery. And as he prepared to uncover the final secrets of the town, he realized that the answers he sought might come at a cost far greater than he was prepared to pay. Caldwell could no longer ignore the overwhelming sense of urgency that had been gnawing at him. His investigation had taken on a life of its own, pulling him deeper into the enigma of the vanished town. With every new piece of information, the picture became clearer, yet more terrifying. The town's disappearance was not the end. It was only the beginning of something much larger, much darker. Caldwell realized that his search for answers was no longer a simple academic pursuit. It had become a race against time. Whatever had been unleashed in the town had not simply disappeared with the people. It was still out there, and it was still waiting. It was at this point that Caldwell made a decision. He had to go back. He had to see the town for himself. The survivors, the old maps, the cryptic symbols, everything he had discovered so far had only painted a fragmentary picture. It was clear to him now that he had to confront the source of the town's curse directly, to walk the land where it had all begun, to understand what had been unleashed all those years ago. But even as he packed his bags and prepared for the journey, something in his gut told him that he was not ready. He had uncovered a truth that most people would never have dared to confront, and yet he couldn't let it go. The town, its history, and the malevolent force that had consumed it haunted him. He knew he could not turn back. If he did, the mystery would follow him, lingering in the corners of his mind like a dark shadow. The journey to the town was long, taking Caldwell through dense forests and winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The closer he got, the more uneasy he became. It was as if the very air around him had changed, growing heavier with each passing mile. The landscape felt foreign even though he had studied it in great detail. He had seen the old maps, the photographs, but nothing prepared him for the eerie silence that greeted him as he finally reached the town's outskirts. As he stood at the edge of the town's boundary, Caldwell could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The place was still there, but it was as though it existed in a different dimension, suspended between reality and something far darker. The streets were overgrown with weeds, the buildings sagging and decaying, yet there was something about it that felt wrong. There was no wind, no sound of birds or insects. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dirt road, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The closer he got to the center of town, the more the sense of dread intensified. The buildings, once homes and businesses, now looked like hollow shells, their windows shattered, their doors hanging open. The town had been abandoned for decades, but it felt like it had been forgotten for centuries. Caldwell wandered through the streets, feeling a creeping unease crawl up his spine with every step. He stopped at the old church, the one that had once been the heart of the community. The doors were ajar and he pushed them open, stepping into the darkness inside. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of decay lingered in the stillness. The pews were overturned, the altar shattered, and the stained glass windows were shattered into 1,000 fragments on the floor. It was in the church that Caldwell found something that made his blood run cold. A series of old, faded symbols etched into the stone floor beneath the altar. They matched the symbol he had found on the map. The same dark, ancient sigil that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Caldwell crouched down, running his fingers over the etchings, feeling a chill pass through him as his skin made contact with the cold stone. He realized then that the town had not just been a victim of the force, it had been a vessel. The ritual that had been performed all those years ago had not been a means of protection. It had been a way to contain the force, to bind it to the land. But something had gone wrong. The seal that had once held it in check had weakened, and the force had slowly begun to leak out, consuming everything in its path. The people had been drawn into its influence, one by one, until there was no one left to stop it. And now, Caldwell realized, the town was still bound to it, as if the land itself had become a prison for the force that lurked beneath. As Caldwell stood there, lost in the weight of his discoveries, the silence around him seemed to grow louder. It was no longer just the absence of sound, it felt like something was watching him, listening to his every move. He could feel it in his chest, the tightening sensation, the growing pressure that made it hard to breathe. It was as if the town itself was alive, aware of his presence. Suddenly he heard a sound, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the direction of the town's center. It was a voice, though Caldwell could not make out the words. His heart skipped a beat, and his instincts screamed at him to leave. But he couldn't. He had come too far. He had to know. He made his way toward the source of the whispering, his steps quickening as he neared the town square. The buildings around him seemed to close in, their dark, hollow eyes watching him with an unsettling intensity. As he approached the square, the whispering grew louder, but still incomprehensible. The air felt thick as if the very space around him was warping, shifting, and bending. When he reached the center of the square, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of the town, stood a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The figure was not solid, not fully formed, but it exuded an oppressive presence that made Caldwell's stomach churn. The figure was staring directly at him, though its face was obscured by darkness. The whispers had stopped. The town was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was suffocating, heavy like a weight pressing down on his chest. Caldwell felt a chill crawl up his spine, but he could not move. His body was frozen, as if the town itself had claimed him, held him in place. The figure took a step forward, and Caldwell felt a surge of fear unlike anything he had ever experienced. The air around him seemed to distort, the ground beneath him trembling as the figure drew closer. It was not a man nor a woman, it was something else entirely. Something ancient, something beyond comprehension. The figure was not human. It was something born of the very darkness that had taken root in this forsaken place. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "You should not have come here." The words vibrated through Caldwell's entire being, reverberating in his mind and his chest. They were not just spoken, they were felt. They were the voice of the land, of the force that had consumed the town, that had erased it from history. The town had not disappeared, it had been swallowed, and now Caldwell was standing at the edge of the abyss, looking into the heart of the darkness that had claimed it. With a surge of adrenaline, Caldwell broke free from the spell that had frozen him. He turned and ran, not caring where he was going, only that he had to get away. The ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, and he could hear the faint echoes of the whispers behind him, growing louder with each passing second. The town was alive and it was chasing him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He had seen enough. The town was not just a forgotten place. It was a place of power, of ancient evil, and it was still waiting. Waiting for someone, anyone, to uncover its secrets. Waiting for someone to break the seal once and for all. Caldwell knew deep down that the mystery was far from over. The town was gone, yes, but its darkness was not. It was still there, in the earth, in the air, in the very fabric of reality. And as long as the town remained on the map, the curse would never end. And neither would his search for answers. The days following his return from the town were a blur. Caldwell tried to process what he had experienced, but every time he closed his eyes, the image of that figure, the shadow that seemed to exist both in this world and another, came rushing back. He had been wrong to think that uncovering the truth about the town would bring him closure. In fact, it had only opened a door to a nightmare that he could neither escape nor ignore. The truth was far worse than anything Caldwell had imagined. The force that had consumed the town wasn't a singular event, nor was it a passing phenomenon. It was an ancient, persistent presence that had existed long before the town had ever been founded. It had been lying in wait for centuries, its hunger growing, its influence spreading. And the town, the people, the land, they had all been caught in its web as if the town itself had been nothing more than a vessel, a conduit for something far more powerful and malevolent. Caldwell had tried to return to his research, but every time he sat at his desk, the weight of the discovery pressed down on him like an invisible hand. He couldn't concentrate. He couldn't shake the feeling that the town was still there, still watching him. It wasn't just a place lost in time. It was a living entity, and Caldwell was its latest prey. The whispers hadn't stopped. Though he was no longer physically in the town, Caldwell could still hear them, faint, distant voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes, he'd hear them when he was alone in his study, other times when he was lying in bed, unable to sleep. They were soft at first, like a murmur in the distance, but as the days wore on, they became more insistent, more direct. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, and feel the presence of something just outside the periphery of his awareness. It was as if the town had followed him back into the world, its influence seeping into his life like poison. One night, after yet another restless sleep, Caldwell decided he could not wait any longer. The feeling of being hunted was too strong to ignore. He knew that he couldn't live in this constant state of dread, always wondering if the darkness from the town would eventually consume him. He had to find a way to break the cycle, to stop the influence from spreading further. It wasn't long before Caldwell realized that the whispers were not just a product of his fear. They were more than just figments of his imagination. They were real. They were reaching out to him, trying to pull him back. The figure he had seen in the town, the shadow, the presence, hadn't been a warning. It had been an invitation. Caldwell wasn't just a researcher. He was a part of the story now, a part of the town's dark history, and it wouldn't let him go.